Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I will talk about the rumble in Bender. Many have heard of the expression, but what did actually happen in Bender and what were the underlying factors that led to the rumble? How many people actually know that the Swedish king Charles XII stayed for several years in the Turkish city of Bender and in reality ruled Sweden in the years 1709 to 1713 from Turkey? I will use a number of spectacular and historically significant medals as a storyteller, and with these in my hand, I will transport you as a listener back to a decisive time in Swedish history. But first, a short introduction to the rumble in Bender. In the year of 1700, Charles XII and Sweden were forced into war when Sweden's common enemies, Russia, Denmark and Poland-Saxony, simultaneously declared war on Sweden and attacked Sweden's borders on three fronts. The new king of the superpower Sweden, Charles XII, had been crowned just a few years earlier in 1797 and was considered an unproven card by its enemies. What has gone down in history as the Great Nordic War now broke out, and it would appear that Sweden's enemies greatly misjudged the young Charles XII, who, through his leadership and tactical skills, contributed to initial success in the war by quickly forcing Denmark to its knees. Peace was concluded in Traventhal on August 18th in 1700, and the independence of the allied state Holstein was restored. Denmark was forced to give an assurance not to support Sweden's other enemies in the war. The peace treaty is illustrated by, among other things, this very rare medal engraved by Johann Reinhard Engelhardt. The medal has previously been part of one of the largest medal collections in our time, namely Baron Bonde at Eriksberg's castle. On the obverse, the king's right-facing bust is depicted wearing mantle-draped armor, still depicted with the wig as the fashion of the time prescribed. In the legend we can read his names and titles: Carolus, 12, DG, Sve, Gut, Van, Rex. Below the shoulder, the year of the peace treaty is 1700, and below the image the engraver's initials, IRE. On the reverse of the medal, the propaganda itself is expressed, and here a lion walking on the northern part of the globe is shown. Above, the sun of the Trinity shines between clouds, and in the legend, Arctum fortus prudentia temperat orbem, and the text translated reads, "The valiant wisdom reigns over Northernland." Now it was time for Charles XII to deal with the Russian threat and Narva, occupied by Russian troops. When the king reached the besieged Narva in November 1700, he faced an opponent 3 times as strong. The battle that followed has gone down in history as one of the greatest Swedish victories. The Swedish losses amounted to just under 900 dead and 1,200 wounded. How many Russians were killed in the battle is uncertain, but the Russian losses are usually estimated at between 6,000 and 8,000 men. Now we jump forward a little in history, and now Charles XII marched into Poland, and after a long campaign he defeated his cousin August the Strong's Saxon army. The Battle of Fraustadt is also considered one of the greatest victories in Swedish military history. In February 1706, Saxony sent an army of 20,000 soldiers under the command of Field Marshal Schulenburg against Rensköld's army. On February 13th, the armies met outside Fraustadt, where the Swedish succeeded in carrying out a so-called double envelopment, which completely crushed Schulenburg's army. 3/4 of the Saxon army were killed or captured in the battle, while the Swedish losses were estimated at around 1,400 soldiers. August was now forced to make peace with Sweden in Altenstadt in Saxony on September 14, 1706, between Sweden and Poland on one hand and Saxony on the other. The peace forced August the Strong to renounce the Polish crown and recognize Stanislaw as King of Poland. On this silver medal, which was once part of the great collection of Sune Eberhard Krona, the right-facing image of the king is depicted with the inscription Karl XII R. Svek Pacifator, which tells us that Charles XII, King of Sweden, was the peacemaker in 1706. And on the reverse of the medal we can read Saxony Sarmatia Felicitas, which tells us that the king brought happiness to Saxony and Sarmatia. By studying the various medal issues, we can follow the successes of the war. The medals was mainly used as royal propaganda. However, the fortunes of war turned during the campaign against Russia, which began in the fall of 1707 and which ended with his decisive defeat in the Battle of Poltava in 1709. On June 28, 1709, the attack on Peter the Great's fortified positions were carried out with 17,000 men from the Swedish main force. Unfortunately, it went really bad when a large part of the Swedish force was annihilated and the battle was lost. It is estimated that as many as 9,000 soldiers were killed in the battle itself, and about 3,000 wounded were left on the battlefield and went into Russian captivity. Charles XII and the remaining army fled in tumultuous forms. On July 1st, the Swedish army reached the river Dnieper, where Charles XII and a few thousand soldiers crossed the river. The remaining part of the army, under Löwenhaupt's command, was to cross the river later, but after the king had departed, Löwenhaupt and the Swedish officers became despondent. When General Menshikov with the Russian skirmish company boldly called on the Swedes to surrender, Löwenhaupt agreed to this and surrendered without any attempt to resist. Through the capitulation at Perevolotnya on July 1st, as well as after the Battle of Poltava, a total of 16,358 Swedish soldiers and officers and 6,466 civilians ended up in Russian captivity. Sweden never recovered from this disaster, and this was the decisive nail in the coffin for Sweden as a superpower. On July the 2nd, Charles XII was met by Sultan Ahmed III's emissary Joseph Pasha, who approved the king's application for asylum to Turkish territory and directed him to settle in the small town of Bender. The king accepted this decision, after which he and his entourage arrived at the outskirts of Bender on July 22nd. Around this time, the king also received the news that his sister Hedvig Sophia had died of smallpox on December 12, 1708. Charles, he took this loss very hard, and it would take a year before he could finally accept her death. Missing Hedvig Sophia made him confide more and more in his younger sister Ulrika Eleonora. On this picture from 1724 by William Hogarth from Aubrey de la Mottre's diary shows Charles XII's camp outside Bender. Over the years, Charles XII ruled his kingdom at a distance from the Ottoman Empire. Over time, the king's settlement developed into a Swedish city under the name of Karlopolis. The Swedish civil service became very inefficient during this time, as the journey for a career across Europe could take between 3 and 12 months. Charles XII discussed with his advisors about various proposals that would improve Swedish business, for example, facilitating trade and crafts and encouraging immigration of craftsmen, the establishment of factories and the building up of new cities. Everything was of course aimed to increase the state's tax revenue to finance new war enterprises, and Charles XII was impatient. It was, he thought, therefore important to quickly set up a new army in Sweden, and therefore he began comprehensive reforms of Sweden's economy and finance. However, the king received constant complaints from the government in Stockholm about the kingdom's difficult situation and that several subjects could not pay their taxes, while the rich subjects were unwilling to put the resources at the state's disposal. This strengthened Charles' opinion that the Swedish tax system needed to change, which was realized in 1713 through the introduction of a wealth tax. This was a proven trick to simply force the subjects to pay for the state's rampant and, in this case, irresponsible foreign policy. The tax sum was 2% of a person's entire fortune and was to be levied equally by all Swedish subjects, regardless of their status. This tax aroused protests mainly from the wealthy landowners. From the Sultan and various Turkish dignitaries, Charles often received lavish gifts and, in consideration of Turkish customs, despite his limited financial resources, he showed his own gratitude by reciprocating with lavish gifts and bribes of his own. After the loss of Poltava and the flight to Turkey, Charles had lost large parts of the war treasury, which had the effect that his financial situation was under severe pressure. To improve the financial situation, Charles was granted by the Sultan 2 loans of 400,000 and 500,000 riksdaler respectively, as well as daily provisions and other goods to the value of 500 riksdaler. But when the king did not have enough money, he had to take out substantial loans from Western European trading houses as well from private individuals in the Ottoman Empire. And slowly but surely the king's situation now became more and more strained, and his creditworthiness became steadily worse the longer his stay in Turkey lasted. And in 1714 it was so severe that the money could only be procured against a very high interest. Altogether, Charles accumulated about 2.5 million riksdaler in debt during his entire stay in Turkey, which corresponded to half of Sweden's annual state income. Several medals were struck and issued for the occasion of the king's stay in Bender during the years 1709 to 1713, including this historically significant bronze medal where the obverse is engraved by Georg Wilhelm Westner and the reverse by Philipp Heinrich Müller. On the obverse of this medal, the king is depicted, and in the legend, Carolus 12 DG Rex Svecia, which translates into Charles XII by the grace of God, King of Sweden. Below the image, the engraver's initial V for Westner. On the reverse, a lion symbolizing the king lying asleep on the ground beside a tall tree. In the background, boats are seen on the water, and even further in the distance, a Turkish mosque at the foot of a mountain. In the sky, crescent moon shines between stars and scattered clouds. In the legend, Per amica silentia lune, and at the bottom, Ocolus dormitat apertis. The full text in translation: under the friendly silence of the moon, the Swedish lion, Charles XII, sleeps with open eyes. The main reason for Charles' long stay in Turkey was that the king hoped to induce the Turks to open up a second front against Russia in southern Europe, which would ease the military pressure on Sweden. Charles' plan included a joint Swedish-Turkish Tatar attack that would defeat Peter of Russia and again force August II to abdicate his Polish throne. To carry out his plan, he ordered the council in Stockholm to equip and arrange for the transport of a Swedish army to Swedish Pomerania, which could then march into Poland and attack the Russian troops there, while the king himself would attack from the south, and, as he then believed, at the head of the Turkish Tatar army. But Sweden had now played out its role as a military power. No army from Sweden was visible that could open up the second front against Russia. During the summer of 1711, the Grand Vizier Baltachi Mehmed Pasha led a Turkish Tatar army of 100,000 men against Peter of Russia, who on July 9, 1711, surrounded the Tsar's troops at Prut River and were forced to negotiate peace, where the Tsar was granted a free retreat to Russia in exchange for the promise of certain concessions, and where the only point that concerned Sweden was that the Tsar promised not to prevent Charles' return home to Sweden. Charles of Sweden and the Grand Vizier's difference of opinion were expressed in a later meeting with each other, where they argued about the peace terms unfavorable to Charles and about the Turks' dissatisfaction that the king had not yet fulfilled his promise of a Swedish attack on Poland via Pomerania. A few months after the peace settlement, the Turks again ended up at war with Russia when Peter did not comply with previous agreement, as the Turks had not yet sent Charles home to Sweden. To change the Tsar's mind, Baltachi Mehmed repeatedly urged Charles to return home, offering him a large escort of 12,000 men. However, the king refused to travel as he did not yet consider himself to have achieved his objectives with a stay in Bender. On October 31st, 1712, the Turks declared war on Russia for the third time, and a Turkish attack was planned for the spring of 1713. Charles of Sweden now recognized a new chance and authorized General Stenbock to be personally responsible for the commanding and rearming of a Swedish army in Pomerania. Stenbock now successfully completed his mission without any problems. In mid-September 1712, Stenbock was able to land an army of 14,000 men on Rügen in Pomerania, which was greeted with great satisfaction in Turkey. But now the unexpected occurs. Instead of marching southeast to take part in the attack on Russia, a truce was concluded with August II. The news of this was a great disappointment to both Charles and the Turkish leadership. Ahmed III was thus now completely convinced that it was best that Charles should be immediately sent to his homeland to once again take over the leadership of the Swedish army. Now, the Turks had more than enough after 3.5 years' stay at the beginning of January 1713, which had stretched the limits of all diplomatic hospitality that could be mustered. The grand plan of a Swedish-Turkish Tatar attack against the common hereditary enemy Russia had thus not materialized, despite repeated promises from Charles XII. The Turkish Sultan Ahmed III now gave orders to take Charles as prisoner and then return him back to Sweden by force. But it was, of course, of the utmost importance that Charles should not be killed or injured even if he defended himself. The Sultan, at the same time, wrote to Charles that a Turkish Tatar force of about 10,000 men would escort him home through Poland, adding that if the king refused to travel, he would be forced by his military. Charles, of course, refused to accept this offer, as he feared that he instead would be handed over to the enemy. The Turks now laid siege to Charles' camp and simply tried to starve the Swedes out. Both sides, with both the Janissaries and the king's senior officers, meanwhile made unsuccessful attempts to convince Charles to surrender himself. Instead, the king had his camp fortified and his troops prepared for battle. On Saturday, January 31st, 1713, around 3,000 Janissaries and 7,000 Tatars gathered outside the Swedish camp. On the morning of February the 1st, some 50 Janissaries were sent to inform Charles that the attack would be called off if the king surrendered to them in exchange for a hostage, and that they promised to take him directly to the Sultan. Charles, he refused as usual, and in the face of this nervous pressure, 500 Swedes allowed themselves to be taken prisoners, while the king himself, together with 45 Swedish soldiers and civil servants, defended themselves in the camp's royal house. The king and the Swedish defenders managed to repel several Turkish attacks. The soldier Axel Erik Roos distinguished himself during the battle and, according to witnesses, is said to have saved Charles' life 3 times during the rumble, among other things by protecting the king with his own body. After a fierce battle that went on for 7 or 8 hours, the royal house was burnt down and Charles and the surviving defenders were overpowered and taken as prisoners of the Sultan and transported to Bender. And this forced expulsion of Charles XII from the camp has gone down in history as the Rumble in Bender. After this incident of Charles XII's stubborn resistance, the Turks gave him the nickname Demirbas, which translates into Iron Head. In Aubry de la Montreuil's diary, we can read following, where he describes Charles XII shortly after the rumble in 1713. The king's face bore no trace of sadness or dejection, but the upper part of the nose and the lobe of the ear were slightly scratched and bloody from the bullet fired by the janissary. The king had also received a burnt eyebrow, the top of his cap split by a sabre cut, a slight wound in his left hand, and finally his robe bloodied and torn in several places. Moreover, one always observed in him the same greatness of soul and pride. I was assured on this occasion that no one could have a more dignified conduct than this prince in all that he undertook, and I have never seen anyone who looked better on a horseback. On the orders of the Turkish Sultan Ahmed III, Charles XII was escorted from Bender on February 6 towards the port city of Saloniki for a possible transport to a Greek island. But after the king's protests, the journey was instead directed to a small town of Demotika, where he arrived on March 6. For a long time after the rumble in Bender, the king was completely bedridden, possibly suffering from exhaustion syndrome and depression as a result of his severe setbacks in recent years. Here, the long journey home to Sweden eventually took place, but this is another story for another video. This whole story is rounded off with a particularly interesting medal, perhaps one of the most historically significant ever issued, namely the medal describing the rumble of Bender itself. This medal is engraved by Georg Wilhelm Westner and included in the large standard reference work by Bror Emil Hildebrand from 1874 with number 167. On the obverse of the medal, the king is depicted wearing armor with a cloak draped over the cuirass, as well as the inscription Carolus 12, Svekor Gotor Vandalorum Rex, which translates into Charles XII, King of Svear, Göter and Wenders. Below the king's image, the engraver's initials, GWV. And here comes what makes this medal so interesting and exciting. On the reverse, the entire story is told in German, in 3 lines in the legend describing the sequence of events, and in the center, a hymn text is invoked. The German text in translation reads, 1713, on the 31st of January, the royal Swedish headquarters at Varnitsa near Bender in Turkey was besieged by many thousands of Turks, Tatars, Lipkans, Janissars and Moldavers, etc., and fired upon with 27 cannon shots, and the following day, on the 1st of February, taken by fire and storm. In the center, the text, I fear not multitudes of many thousands, which encamp against me round about. What makes the coins and medals extra interesting is precisely their role as storytellers and their ability to transport the viewer to bygone times and places. Certainly, the story that is told is often rather one-eyed, idealized and unbalanced, and is representative of the worldview of the king and his followers. But, nevertheless, they open up an interesting window into our history. We must not forget that the medals were the megaphones of the time and carriers of imperialistic propaganda that was unshamedly sent out from the ruling elite. Through the collection of these time machines, you get a view, or perspective if you want, into the history of the region, and it is of course also important to look critically at the sender's propaganda and relate to exactly for what it is. But regardless, with this medal you can travel through history and experience things that would not otherwise be possible. Most of us has probably heard of Charles XII and Sweden as a superpower, but also the term of the rumble in Bender. The medals are fascinating and interest-generating topics for discussion in practically any context. Bring out the medal when you have friends over and tell them the story of the medal. I'm convinced that many people find it interesting, and you can therefore easily help spread the interest in coins and medal collecting. Medals of this kind are also affordable for most collectors and are by no means purely museum objects. I hope you find this video interesting, and to help others with a historical and/or numismatic interest watch this video, please like, share, comment and subscribe. It is free to subscribe and you don't commit to anything, nor will you receive any unwanted emails or offers from me, and you can, whenever you want, end your subscription. By subscribing, liking and sharing, you help YouTube's and Google's algorithms to rank up this video and thus make it easier for others with a similar interest to view this video. Also, make sure to hit the notification bell to get notified when I publish new video on YouTube. Thank you for watching.